Welcome to the Dynamics of Everyday Life, where we demystify some tricky concepts and get to know ourselves a little bit better. Welcome back to the Dynamics of Everyday Life. Today I'm excited to bring this topic as it's another one that came up unexpectedly during a conversation recently. These moments always light me up as they highlight a really important part of why I do the podcast, and it's also one of the reasons behind the name. Quick aside in the name of the show. It's called The Dynamics of Everyday Life for two interlinked reasons. The first is that I want to make information and understanding about the psychodynamic world accessible to everyone who wants to learn more about themselves, and the easiest way to do that is to make it relatable to how we live our lives. It's also a nod to Freud's The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, published in the early 1900s, where he seeks to help us understand that the things we do in life aren't a random collection of meaningless behaviour. There's unconscious motivation behind all that we do, and if we can understand that, then we can understand ourselves better too. I'm not quite in Freud's league, no 24 volumes of the standard edition to my name just yet, but I like to think I'm doing my bit. Anyway, back to the Yellow Brick Road. Ever since I entered the world of coaching just over 10 years ago, I've often thought that the story of the Wizard of Oz, and in particular Dorothy's journey along the Yellow Brick Road, is an excellent metaphor for the lives that we lead. I especially love the wizard booming, "Who are you?" when Dorothy et al. Finally get their audience with him. It's a great question. Who are you indeed? And the lion ends up being so overwhelmed by the whole experience that he flings himself out of the nearest window. But it's the journey to Oz that fascinates me, and what would have happened if Dorothy could have taken a shortcut? The start of the Yellow Brick Road is in Munchkinland, not Kansas, as Dorothy quite rightly points out. It's an exciting, vibrant world, with good and bad elements. Glinda, the Good Witch of the North, and the Wicked Witch of the West, who interestingly does not have a name. Already we can see some psychodynamic elements creeping in, with the splitting of good and bad. Glinda is all good. The Wicked Witch of the West is all bad. There are no shades of grey here. I'd argue that the Wicked Witch is perhaps more interesting, but that might be for another episode. To find her answers about how to get home, Dorothy must follow the Yellow Brick Road to the Emerald City, where the great and mighty wizard will be able to solve all her problems. Actually, there's a lot in here too about needing to be rescued and gender dynamics, but let's stick on course. As she doesn't have a broomstick, and the way that she arrived is no longer an option, then Dorothy must walk and make her own way. Just like in life, there are no maps to Oz, or if there are any, then Dorothy isn't given one. And it's not a straight path without any choices to be made. There are choices which Dorothy needs to decide upon, on her own. And these choices will have an impact on what will happen next for Dorothy, who she'll meet, and what part they'll play in her journey. Most of us will know the story of the Wizard of Oz. I was going to say everyone has watched the film, but as I discovered last week, that's just not true. It's an assumption that I had. But I'm not going to repeat what happens scene by scene, as that gets in the way of considering what learning we might be able to take away from this, as well as some catchy show tunes going round in your head. The key points for me about there being no shortcut on the Yellow Brick Road are: Dorothy starts off on the journey alone, with no instructions apart from to follow the Yellow Brick Road. She must make her own choices and decisions. If Dorothy had borrowed a broomstick from Glinda, supposing she had a couple of spare ones knocking around, then Dorothy wouldn't have met her friends, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man and the Lion. Dorothy wouldn't have learnt all she needed to learn to get herself home, to get herself back to who she is. So how can we apply these points to our lives, view them through a psychodynamic lens, and learn more about who we are and what we want? The obvious parallel is that we all have to make our journeys alone. We're given guidance, but at some point we're going to be like Dorothy and come to a crossroads where we must make a decision about which way to go. We might not all meet our Scarecrow at our crossroads, but we'll have help along the way. It's up to us to decide what we do with it. Dorothy could have ignored the Scarecrow, turned down a different route, and ended up having another experience altogether. It could be argued that there was some unconscious drive in Dorothy that motivated her to respond to the Scarecrow and invite him to join her on her journey. So that's one thing to put on our mental post-it notes. There's a dynamic between Dorothy and the Scarecrow, and later on the Tin Man and the Lion, that pushes them forward together, the need to bond. From a neuroscientific point of view, this makes sense. We need to feel part of a group to survive. Back in prehistoric times, if you weren't part of a group, you didn't have that protection, so you were at greater risk of being attacked by a lion, tiger or bear. Hence why Dorothy forms her own group, possibly unconsciously, to protect her from the witch. However, when the friends get to the Emerald City, defeat the witch, and are ready to start the next part of their stories, it's important to note that they might not necessarily be doing that together. Dorothy and Toto are leaving, and whilst the Scarecrow, Tin Man and Lion are staying in the Emerald City, we've no idea where their journeys will take them. So in adopting a helicopter view of the function of the Yellow Brick Road and the importance that it plays in the narrative, it makes me wonder, why do we even think about shortcuts? What are we trying to avoid? What do we think they're there to do? Let's be honest, we're all drawn to the idea of a shortcut. Who hasn't sat in traffic and wished for a James Bond style route not known to everyone else queuing up at the Hanger Lane gyratory? For me, the main players here are defence mechanisms. If we want to avoid something, it's because we link it to feelings of anxiety, and we know that this is something that we want to avoid at all costs. Our unconscious is on high alert, scanning for potential danger, and whilst we intellectually know that we might meet our own Scarecrow, Tin Man and Lion along the way, there's every possibility that we might come into contact with the witch too. And will we be able to fight her off? Do we even know what our own particular witch looks like? Let's get our bingo cards out. We've got denial. We don't want to consider the possibility that things might get tricky down our own yellow brick roads. If we take a shortcut, then we're cutting down the amount of time that our own witch can attack us. And if we can't see the witch, we can pretend that she doesn't exist. It also cuts down the possibility that we might fail at reaching the end of the yellow brick road. We're reducing the amount of obstacles in the way, but we're not taking into account the learning we get from overcoming the obstacles. As Dorothy is about to leave Oz, her friends say that they should have been able to tell her that she could get home at any time. But Glinda says, "You've always had the power, my dear, you just had to learn it for yourself." Whilst we deny anxiety and the associated pain, we're also denying ourselves the learning that comes along with it. A new one to mark off our cards today is isolation. This is one of Freud's original defence mechanisms, closely linked to repression. But what's happening here is the creation of a gap between unpleasant or threatening thoughts and other thoughts and feelings. By creating a gap, we're breaking the chain and lessening the connection with the unpleasant thought. We want these thoughts as far away as possible from the other part of our minds. We can often do this by inserting a pause between one topic of conversation and another. And the more we create a gap, the weaker the thought becomes. Another way to look at it would be that we're strengthening the neural pathways that we want to focus on. By taking a shortcut, particularly on roads ahead that we know or perceive will be difficult, we are in effect isolating ourselves from those anxiety-inducing thoughts. We can feel quite pleased with ourselves that we've avoided them. And maybe we have. However, it's likely though that our own particular witches will find their way to us anyway. My invitation to you this week is to consider where in your life you might be taking shortcuts and why you might be doing this. Is it that you have so much packed into your day that it's a way of getting as much done as you possibly can? Or is this the message that you're giving yourself? Maybe a bit of rationalisation is creeping in here. Is it that the shortcuts you are taking allow you to avoid thinking about things or doing activities that you would really rather not? As always, I do say give yourself some grace here. When we go down our own yellow brick road of discovering what's lurking in our unconsciousness, there's probably a few lions, tigers and bears which can give us a bit of a jolt. We all have defence mechanisms, and for very good reasons. It's up to us to decide whether they're working for us or not. Looking at ourselves at this level can be challenging and unnerving as we develop our awareness, so I'd always encourage that you do this at your own speed. If you feel you need some extra help around this, then I've put together a PDF resource sheet and you can find the link for this in the show notes. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Dynamics of Everyday Life. Please hit the follow button for future episodes and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can follow me on Instagram at The Dynamics of Everyday Life or find me on LinkedIn at Julia Rogers. I'd love to hear from you and hear your thoughts on dynamics. The Dynamics of Everyday Life is brought to you by Coaching 42 and the fabulous team at the Podcast Boutique.